The smell of fresh paint hadn't fully faded from the walls of the house I had just bought. 47 days. That was how long I had owned it before the man I thought I was going to spend my life with sat across from me at our kitchen table in our house, with his coffee mug leaving a ring on the counter I had picked out, and told me his mother needed to move in. Not asked. Told. I remember staring at the ring on my left hand and thinking, this is not the life I signed up for. But let me back up, because the story doesn't start there. It starts 2 years earlier, in the break room of the financial consulting firm where I work, where my fiancé, I'll call him my ex-fiancé now, because that's what he is, walked in holding a broken umbrella and wearing a suit that was just slightly too big for him, and smiled at me like he had been looking for me his whole life. I was 29. I had just made senior analyst. I had a savings account I was proud of, a studio apartment I loved, and absolutely no interest in being swept off my feet. And then he swept me off my feet anyway. He was charming in the quiet way that's harder to resist than the loud way. He remembered things, the name of my college roommate after I mentioned her once, the fact that I didn't like cilantro, the anniversary of my mother's passing, which I had only told him about once in passing. He showed up. He was consistent. And after 8 months of dating, I thought I knew exactly who he was. His family was traditional. He told me that early, and I appreciated the honesty. His mother had stayed home to raise him and his younger brother. His father had worked in construction and built a comfortable life from nothing. They were tight-knit, close. He said it like it was a selling point, and at the time, I thought it was. The first time I met his mother, she hugged me for a long time and said she had heard so much about me. The first time I met his father, he shook my hand firmly and said my boyfriend was lucky. The first time I met his younger brother's wife, she gave me a look I didn't fully understand until much later. A look that I now recognize as someone who has already learned something the hard way, trying to decide whether to warn you. She didn't warn me. I don't blame her for that. We got engaged on a Tuesday, which surprised me because I always assumed proposals happened on weekends or holidays or in restaurants with good lighting. He proposed in the parking garage of our office building on the 3rd floor next to my car because that was where we had our first real conversation, and he remembered that. I said yes before he finished the sentence. For 6 months, everything was exactly what I had always imagined engagement would be. We looked at venues, we argued pleasantly about the guest list, we talked about money openly, which I considered a very good sign. He made less than I did, significantly less, because he was in sales and his income fluctuated, and I was salaried with bonuses, and we had agreed early on that this was not a problem, that we were a team, that what was mine was ours, and what was ours was shared. That conversation felt very different in retrospect. The house came about because the market was moving, and I had been saving for years, and I had enough for a down payment that would make the mortgage manageable even on one income. My fiancé contributed what he could, which was $22,000. I put in $116,000. We argued about whether to put both names on the deed immediately or wait until after the wedding, and I agreed to wait, and not as the first decision I wish I had made differently. Not because I didn't trust him. Because I trusted him without having earned that trust yet, and there is a difference. The house was beautiful. 3 bedrooms, a backyard with an oak tree, a kitchen with enough counter space that I could actually cook without feeling like I was performing surgery. I painted the front door a deep green because I had always wanted a deep green door, and every morning when I left for work I felt a specific kind of pride that I had never felt before. I had built something. I had a place that was mine. It was a Thursday evening in October when my fiancé came home later than usual, poured himself a glass of water instead of his usual evening beer, and sat down at the kitchen table with the look of a man who had been rehearsing something in the car. His mother, he said, had been having a hard time. His father's health had been declining. I knew this. There had been a hospitalization in August, and his mother was struggling with the house and the bills and the daily weight of being a caregiver. His brother's apartment was too small. The logical solution, he said, was for his mother to move in with us, into the 3rd bedroom. Temporarily, he said. Just until things stabilized. I asked him how long he thought that would take. He said he wasn't sure. I asked him when he had decided this. He said it wasn't a decision yet, it was a conversation. I said it sounded like a decision to me. He said I was being rigid. That was the first time he used that word to describe me. It would not be the last. I want to be honest here. I did not immediately recognize what was happening. I am not someone who jumps to conclusions. I am an analyst by profession and by temperament, and my instinct is always to gather more information before forming a judgment. So I did not say no. I said I needed to think about it, and I thought about it, and 3 days later I came to him with a compromise. His mother could stay for up to 3 months. We would set a clear timeline and we would reassess together. He said he would talk to his mother. What I did not know was that his mother had already been told she was moving in. I found this out at Sunday dinner, which was a weekly ritual with his family that I had come to genuinely enjoy. His mother mentioned in front of everyone that she was looking forward to being closer to her son once she had settled in. She said it the way you mention something that has already been decided and announced and is simply now in the logistics phase. She did not look at me when she said it. I looked at my fiancé. He was looking at his plate. I excused myself to use the bathroom, stood in his parents' hallway for approximately 90 seconds, and made a decision about how to handle the next 20 minutes, with a level of composure that I am still somewhat proud of. I went back to the table. I ate the rest of dinner. I smiled. I helped clear the plates. In the car on the way home, I said nothing for 4 miles. Then I said, "You told her before we finished the conversation." He said he hadn't wanted her to worry. I said, "You told her before we finished the conversation." He said, "You would have said no." And there it was. The next 2 weeks were the kind of argument that doesn't happen all at once but keeps resurfacing, every evening, every quiet moment, every meal. He said I didn't understand family obligation. I said I understood it fine, but I also understood that a $300,000 asset registered in his name should not become a de facto family residence without my explicit agreement. He said I was making it about money. I said, money is a real thing that real people have to think about. His mother called me one afternoon while I was at my desk at work. She said she hoped there were no hard feelings. She said she just wanted what was best for her son. She said she knew I was a practical woman, and she was sure I understood that family came first. I said I understood that completely. She said wonderful. She said she was so glad I was practical. She said she had been a little worried that I might be the kind of woman who put her own comfort above the needs of the family. She said she was glad I wasn't that kind of woman. I hung up the phone, stared at my computer screen for a moment, and then called my best friend, who is also, conveniently, a real estate attorney. My best friend listened to everything. She did not say I told you so, though I could hear her carefully not saying it. She said, "Is his name on the deed?" I said yes. She said, "We need to talk about some things." She walked me through what joint tenancy meant in our state. She walked me through what a cohabitation agreement could and could not do. She walked me through what would happen if we married and what would happen if we didn't. She talked to me for 45 minutes in the kind of clear, direct language that I associate with people who care enough about you to tell you difficult things without dressing them up. At the end, she said, "I'm not telling you to leave. I'm telling you to get informed." I got informed. What I learned over the following week changed the texture of everything I looked at in that house. I had contributed 5 times what my fiancé had. I had found the house, negotiated the price, arranged the inspection, managed the entire closing process largely on my own because he had been traveling for work. My name was not on the deed. If we married, depending on how things were structured, his family's presence in the house and the financial decisions that came with it would become substantially more complicated to challenge. I asked my fiancé one evening very calmly whether he had given any thought to how household finances would work once his mother moved in. Whether she would contribute to the mortgage, whether there was a plan. He said she was family. Family didn't pay rent. I asked him who would be responsible for the additional utility costs, the grocery costs, the general maintenance that comes with another person in a house. He said we would figure it out. I said, "I'd like to figure it out now." He said I was being cold. That was the second word he started using for me. Cold. Rigid, practical in a tone that made it sound like a character flaw. I went to dinner with his family the following Saturday. His brother and his brother's wife were there. His mother was there. His father, who was not well, stayed home. Over pasta and what I had come to understand was a very deliberate display of family warmth, the kind that was generous and suffocating in equal measure. His mother raised her glass and said she wanted to toast to the next chapter. She said she had always believed that a home was strongest when the whole family was together. She said she was so glad her son had found someone who understood the value of that. His brother's wife looked at the table. I set my glass down. I said, I actually want to make sure I understand correctly. What does together look like, specifically? What would my mother-in-law's role be in the house? What would be expected of me? There was a pause. His mother said, warmly, that she didn't think it needed to be formalized. She said she just wanted to be helpful. She said she had been running a household for 30 years and she knew things that might take me a while to learn. I said, what kinds of things? She said things like meal planning, like keeping a proper household, like being available for family when family needed you. I said, available in what sense? She said, well, if someone needed to be driven to an appointment, or if there were family obligations on holidays, or if his father had a bad week and needed support. She trailed off and smiled and said she just meant being present, being a family member. I looked at my fiancé. He was nodding. I said, I want to be clear about something. I work full-time at a demanding job. I contribute significantly to the house where we'll be living. I support this relationship completely, and I want to support your family. But I need to understand whether what you're describing is a general expectation of warmth and presence, or whether there are specific obligations you have in mind for me as a future daughter-in-law. His mother looked at me for a moment. Then she said very gently that she hadn't realized I thought of family as obligations. And his brother said from across the table that maybe I should think about what kind of wife I wanted to be. I put my napkin on the table. I said I needed some air. I went outside and stood in the driveway for a while, and I called my best friend and I said, I think I already know the answer, but I need to say it out loud to someone. I need to know if I'm being unreasonable. She said, describe to me exactly what they said. I described it exactly what they said. I described it exactly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you're not being unreasonable. And I say that as someone who wants you to be happy with this man. I went back inside. I ate the rest of dinner. I smiled. I helped clear the plates. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark in the house I had largely purchased, listening to my fiancé breathe beside me, and I ran numbers the way I always do when I'm trying to make sense of something that doesn't feel logical. I had been with this man for 2 years. I had seen his family dozens of times. I had attributed the controlling dynamics to cultural tradition and had told myself it didn't involve me, that I was marrying him, not them. I'd told myself that love was a reason to be flexible. What I hadn't accounted for was that flexibility to the people in his family was not a gesture of goodwill. It was an opening. The next morning, I called my best friend before I went to work. I said, I need you to help me understand my options with the property. She said, I've been waiting for this call. We met for lunch. She laid it out clearly. Because the deed was in his name only, my contribution of $116,000 was essentially an informal arrangement, not a legal one. We had never formalized a cohabitation agreement. If we married without a prenuptial agreement, the situation would become more complicated but more protected. If we didn't marry, I had limited legal recourse for my down payment without documentation of the informal agreement, though she believed we had a case. She said the best thing you can do right now is document everything. The financial contributions, the conversations, everything. I said I've been keeping records. She said, of course you have. I spent the following 3 weeks doing what I do best, which is gathering information and building a picture. I went through my bank records and compiled every transfer, every check, every payment. I had emails confirming the down payment structure. I had text messages in which my fiancé had explicitly referenced the house as something we had built together, with my money as the foundation. I had a voicemail from his mother that, when I listened to it again with fresh ears, made the picture considerably clearer. I also, quietly, had a conversation with his brother's wife. We met for coffee on a Wednesday morning. She was 31. She had been married for 4 years. She was careful with her words at first, and I understood why. She lived inside this family in a way I had not yet fully committed to, but eventually she said, in a very measured tone, that the first year of her marriage had involved a significant renegotiation of expectations that she had not anticipated and had not been prepared for. I asked her if she had any regrets. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she loved her husband. She said that was not the same as answering my question. I thanked her. I paid for the coffee. I drove to work and sat in my car for 6 minutes thinking about the difference between loving someone and choosing the life that comes attached to them. I went home that evening and my fiancé was making dinner, which was something he did when he wanted to have a difficult conversation in a setting that felt domestic and calm. He had made pasta, the same pasta his mother had served at Saturday dinner, and I am not sure he realized this. He said he wanted to revisit the conversation about his mother. I said, I think we need to talk about a prenuptial agreement first. He set down the spoon. I explained as clearly and calmly as I could that I loved him and intended to build a life with him, and that a prenuptial agreement was not a statement of distrust, but a practical document that protected both of us and clarified expectations before we entered into a legal contract. I said that, given the financial asymmetry of our contributions to the house, I thought it was especially important. He said he couldn't believe I was making our engagement about money. I said the engagement had been about money since the moment he told his mother she was moving in without finishing the conversation with me. He said his mother had nothing to do with this. I said his mother had everything to do with this. He said I had a problem with his family. I said, I have a problem with being consulted after decisions have been made that directly affect my home and my finances. That is not a family problem. That is a respect problem. He left the room. The pasta burned. I ate a granola bar and sent 3 emails to my best friend with attachments. The following week, I had 2 conversations that changed everything. The first was with my fiancé's mother, who called to tell me, in a very kind and very firm voice, that she was concerned about my attitude toward the family, and that she hoped I understood that a woman who married into their family became part of something larger than herself. She said she had spoken to her son and he was upset. She said she hoped I would take some time to reflect. I said, I appreciate you calling. I'll be in touch. The second conversation was with my best friend, who called me from her office and said she had done some additional research and found that, given the documentation I had provided, I had a strong basis for a claim on the property regardless of whose name was on the deed, particularly since I had text message evidence of my fiancé explicitly acknowledging my financial contribution as the primary one. She said if it came to that, she was confident. She also said, you don't have to let it come to that. I thought about those words for a long time. I called my fiancé and asked him to come home early. He did. We sat at the kitchen table, the table I had carried up from the moving truck with 2 of my work friends on a Saturday morning while he was at a family lunch, and I put a folder between us. I said, I love you. I want to be clear about that because I think it's going to get lost in this conversation. I love you. And I thought we were building something together, and I still believe we could. But I need you to understand something that I've been trying to say for 2 months and that keeps getting called cold or rigid or ungrateful every time I say it. I said, your family's expectation is not just that I will be present and warm and loving. The expectation is that I will subordinate my career, my financial interests, and my personal priorities to the needs of your family structure. And you have been allowing that expectation to grow without ever pushing back on it, which tells me something about what our marriage would actually look like. He said that was not fair. I said, I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to answer it honestly. If your mother moved in and she needed to be taken to a medical appointment on a Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon, and I had a client presentation that I couldn't reschedule, whose needs would take priority? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She's my mother." I said, "I know." I picked up the folder. I said I had spoken to a real estate attorney. I did not say it was my best friend, and that I had documentation supporting my financial claim to the property, and that I was requesting that we either formalize a cohabitation agreement, clarifying my equity stake immediately, or I would be consulting with counsel about how to proceed. He stared at me. I said, "I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to protect myself. Because no one else in this situation is doing that." He called his mother that night. I know because I could hear the conversation through the wall, not the words but the tone. And his mother's tone was the kind I had come to recognize, the warm, controlled, "you need to handle this" tone, that I suspected she had been using on her son his entire life. The next morning, he told me he thought we should postpone the wedding. I said, "I think that's the most honest thing you've said to me in 2 months." He looked surprised. I think he had expected more resistance. I think he had expected tears, or argument, or the kind of emotion that would allow him to reframe the conversation as me being unstable rather than him being incapable of standing up for the relationship he claimed to want. I said, "I'm going to stay with a friend for a few days. I want you to talk to your family and figure out what you actually want. Not what they want. What you want." I stayed with my best friend for 5 days. On day 2, my fiancé's mother called 3 times. I did not answer. On day 3, his brother sent a text saying that his mother was hurt and that I had handled things poorly. I did not respond. On day 4, my fiancé called and said he missed me and he thought we should talk. I said I agreed and asked him to tell me something he had decided, not something he was still thinking about. He was quiet for a while. Then he said he thought his mother moving in was still the right thing, and he hoped I could come around. I said, "Thank you for being honest." On day 5, I called my best friend into her own living room, poured us both a glass of wine, and told her I needed her professional help. She said, "I know. I've already drafted something." The process took 3 weeks, and it was not simple, but it was clean. My best friend had built a case from the documentation I had provided and the explicit acknowledgement in my fiancé's own text messages of my financial contribution was, she told me, as good as a signed agreement in our state's courts. We sent a formal letter requesting either a buyout of my equity stake or a property transfer reflecting my proportional ownership. His family hired their own attorney. Their attorney sent back a letter that questioned the nature of my financial contribution, suggested it could be characterized as a gift rather than an investment, and included language that I found personally insulting. My best friend read it, made a sound I cannot reproduce in writing, and then spent 40 minutes on the phone in the next room. When she came back, she said, "They should not have done that." I will not describe every detail of what followed, because some of it is still, technically, in the realm of settled but private. What I will say is this: the text messages were unambiguous. The bank records were unambiguous. The voicemail from his mother, which I had saved and which contained a reference to your down payment in a context that made the nature of my contribution unmistakable, was unambiguous. My fiancé, faced with the documentation in full, chose not to contest it. The settlement took 6 days. I received a formal acknowledgement of my equity stake and a buyout agreement that reflected the full value of my contribution plus interest calculated from the date of purchase. I did not fight for the house itself, partly because my best friend advised against the timeline of a full property dispute, and partly because I did not want to live in that house anymore. The green front door that I had loved stopped feeling like mine the night his mother called to tell me what kind of woman I should be. I found a new apartment 2 weeks after the settlement was signed. It is smaller than a house, on the 4th floor of a building with an elevator that is slightly unreliable, and the kitchen counter space is laughable. I bought a plant for the window and a coffee maker I had been wanting for 2 years, and a rug that is exactly the color I wanted without having to consult anyone. My fiancé called me once after everything was finalized. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't understood how serious it was. He said his mother meant well. I said, "I believe you that she means well. I believe you that you're sorry. I don't think sorry changes the fact that every time I asked you to choose the relationship, you chose the path of least resistance with your family instead. I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're someone who was never asked to define what he actually wanted, and that means I was trying to build a future with someone who hadn't decided yet what his future looked like. He didn't have anything to say to that. I said I hoped he figured it out. I meant it. The phone calls and texts from his family stopped after the settlement. His mother did not call again. His brother sent one final message that was clearly written in anger and that I archived without responding to. His brother's wife sent me a message 3 weeks later that said only, "I hope you're okay." I wrote back and said I was. I think she understood more than she said. There are things I would do differently. I would have insisted on my name being on the deed from the first day. I would have had a formal agreement in writing before the first dollar was transferred. I would have paid more attention to the look his brother's wife gave me at that first dinner and understood what it meant instead of filing it under cultural differences. I would have had the conversation about family expectations earlier and more directly, and I would not have softened it because I was afraid of seeming cold. But here is what I know now that I didn't know 2 years ago. Love that requires you to make yourself smaller is not love that will make you happy. It is love that will make you disappear, slowly, in ways so incremental that you won't notice until you are standing in someone else's kitchen trying to remember what you wanted your life to look like. I know what I want my life to look like. I know what I bring to it, and I know what I deserve in return. I know the difference between compromise, which is something 2 people do together, and capitulation, which is something one person does while the other one watches. I turned 31 last month. My best friend threw me a small dinner at her apartment. 8 people, pasta, good wine, the kind of evening that feels exactly like itself and doesn't need to be anything more. Someone asked me about my relationship status, in the gentle way people do when they're curious but trying to be kind, and I said I was doing really well actually. Because I am. The apartment is small and the elevator is unreliable and there's not enough counter space. But every morning when I make coffee in the kitchen, I chose. In the apartment, I signed for a loan, with my name on the lease and my name only. I feel the specific kind of pride that I felt the first time I drove up to that house with the green door. It turns out you don't need a house for that feeling. You just need to know that what you have is actually yours.